For over 25 years, an axiom of American politics was that evangelical Protestantism was politically conservative. The notion was not without its illogic, since it assumed that conservative religion and conservative politics went hand in hand. The problem with this logic for evangelicalism was that conservatism in religion, prior to 1970 at least, meant that born-again Protestantism was an otherworldly faith that was more concerned with saving souls for the world to come than with turning out voters to decide on matters of the here and now. This is why evangelicals prior to the Reagan Revolution had the reputation for being quietists, that is, people who were chiefly passive regarding the policies governing the United States. I say reputation because my hunch is that most evangelicals, like my parents, cared about their nation and voted. They simply lacked religious or political leaders who would rally them as an electoral bloc. Yet despite these challenges to contemporary assumptions about religion and politics, evangelicalism has, since at least the founding of the moral majority in 1979, become synonymous with conservatism. From polling data to assumptions about the coherence of politics and religion, born-again Protestantism, in the minds of journalists, pundits, and scholars, is a powerful constituency without which American conservatism could not have become as dominant as it has been since the election of Ronald Reagan. In point of fact, this axiom of the post-Reagan era of American politics is looking more and more like a hypothesis or even a hope than apodictic truth. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and James Dobson are still in charge of their parachurch fiefdoms and capable of marshaling large numbers of supporters for the Republican Party. But these evangelical leaders are old, and the ones who are likely to fill the vacuum once these figures retire from public life are not nearly so eager to support the GOP or its brand of political conservatism. Indeed, a seldom noticed transition is currently underway in which the born-again greatest generation is giving way to evangelical boomers like myself, every bit as fickle and flaky as their secular Roman Catholic or mainline Protestant counterparts. This generational succession suggests that the days of goodwill and harmonious relations between evangelicalism and American conservatism are coming to an end. Whether the final break will be on the order of an ugly divorce or simply a mutually agreed upon decision to just be friends, the emerging tensions between evangelicals and the right in American politics suggest that we are witnessing their last dance. The results of the 2006 midterm elections could very well be early signs of a more permanent realignment. What I want to do this evening is back up this claim that tension is growing between evangelical Protestantism in the United States and American conservatism. The red state, blue state analysis of the last several presidential contests has obscured the degree to which evangelicalism is an unreliable ally in the conservative constituency. Obviously, many evangelicals in the pews vote consistently for the GOP, but their reasons for doing so are increasingly wearing thin. The reason is that many of the religious convictions that motivate born-again Protestants are at odds with the premises of American conservatism. This is not to say that the Republican Party itself is the arbiter of conservatism properly understood. In fact, the close identification of American conservatism with the Republican Party has posed important difficulties for the conservative supposition articulated over a half-century ago by thinkers like Russell Kirk that culture is more important than politics. Consequently, I don't want to give the impression that the GOP is synonymous with conservatism in the United States. But the recent writings and declarations of various evangelical authors and institutions that express ambivalence about Republican politics is, I believe, indicative of a deeper uncertainty about first-order considerations about human autonomy, legitimate authority, cultural restraint, and the best conditions for human flourishing. After documenting the shift among evangelicals from conservative to more liberal or humanitarian sentiments, I want to try to account for this trend by explaining the religious roots of evangelical, moral, and social idealism. And before concluding, I hope to offer some reflections on what these developments might mean for the future of the religious right. Evangelicalism's problematic relationship to conservatism has been evident for some time, even if the Reagan coalition tried to paper over the difficulty. One way to illustrate this point is to examine the landmark history of a modern American conservatism. George Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, a book originally written as a Harvard University dissertation, first published in 1976 and recently reissued by ISI Books. Judging a book by its index is surely a dangerous enterprise, but nonetheless revealing for certain purposes. Glancing through Nash's index yields no trouble in finding such luminaries of American conservatism as Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley Jr., Frederick Hayek, Frank S. Meyer, Brent Bozell, and Wilmore Kendall. Much more harder to find, however, impossible in fact, is a reference to any evangelical in the post-World War II movement that gave us Fuller Seminary, Christianity Today, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. This may have been an oversight by Nash, an indication that he may have been defining modern conservatism too narrowly or was ignorant of the born-again Protestant world. But by the time the second edition of Nash's book came out in 1996, I believe, which featured an epilogue in which the author attempted to account for conservative developments since the Reagan Revolution, evangelicalism was still a virtual no-show. Nash did devote one page to the religious right and conceded that its concerns were closest to the traditionalist conservatives like Kirk and Richard Weaver. But he also identified an important difficulty that would take some time to play out. Whereas the traditionalists of the 1940s and 1950s had largely been academics in revolt against secularized mass society, Nash explained, the religious right was a revolt by the masses against the secular virus and its aggressive carriers in the nation's elites. End of quote. Unlike traditionalists, then, evangelicals were conservatives who were incapable of spotting structural problems of mass society that contributed to national woes like abortion and pornography. The religious right, unlike the traditionalist right, was not essentially critical of modernity since, as a mass movement, it depended for its very well-being on modern forms of social organization, such as the electronic media, social dislocation, and economic and political centralization. Evangelicals could readily identify specific evils, but had no way to account for the structures that might make such evils plausible, especially if evangelicals themselves depended spiritually on those very structures. During the Cold War, this difference was hard to discern, and once the sexual revolution of the 1960s occurred, even harder to mention. Nash admits, for instance, that leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson generally shared the foreign policy and economic perspectives of other conservatives, even if their guiding preoccupation lay in the sphere of social morality. This was not only true for the religious right, figures from the Reagan coalition, but also for the evangelical leaders just after World War II, to which I now turn. For 25 years after World War II, before Republican strategists and pollsters discovered the potential of the born-again electorate, evangelical ideas on politics were predictably right of center. In his survey of evangelical politics during these decades, the University of Wisconsin political scientist Robert Booth Fowler concluded that born-again Protestant leaders spoke and wrote mainly in defense of free markets, balanced budgets, and common standards of public decency, and also opposed communism as well as domestic policies that might increase the centralization of America's federal government. The defense of freedom was so strong that many evangelical leaders believed even labor unions were incompatible with a liberal society because they impeded free markets. Yet evangelicals were not sanguine about the prospects of the United States. Although they regularly invoked the idea of America's God-blessed status, evangelical spokesmen believed that materialism and hedonism were rapidly dissolving the nation's greatness. In keeping with these general political instincts, evangelical leaders were also suspicious of social action. On the one hand, progressive reforms threatened to increase the power of government and destroy liberty. On the other hand, tinkering with policy and legislation obscured the fundamental problem of human sin, which could only be remedied through faith. For this reason, mainstream evangelical leaders insisted that the church should not be distracted from its primary mission of evangelism to engage in or advocate various social measures.